Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon sessions for the 2022 Join the Journey Digital Accessibility Conference. My name is Chelsea Porter, and I am a digital accessibility consultant at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a white lady wearing a navy blouse with white neckline embroidery. The next presentation is an introduction to ARIA by Gia Branciforte, and she is a front-end developer for the ITS digital services at UNC-Chapel Hill. She builds websites for university departments and units and works closely with clients to plan for and address needs related to accessibility, usability, content management, and governance. She has over a decade of experience in web development and IT, in a career that has touched the nonprofit, retail, arts, healthcare, and higher education sectors. This presentation will be recorded and has professional live captioning available. Slides are also available on the conference website for you to download. If you have any questions for Gia, please use the Q&A option located in your Zoom menu. We will hold questions until the end of the presentation. If you have any issues with Zoom, please let us know in chat or email tap@wfu.edu. And Gia, take it away.
Hi, folks. Thank you for that introduction, Chelsea. My name is Gia Branciforte. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a white lady sitting in front of some child's finger painting, wearing glasses and an orange shirt. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pop that into the right mode. All right, and let me just make sure that I'm sharing the right screen here. Yes. Yeah. Okay, great. So this is Introduction to ARIA. ARIA is a big topic, and I have tried to fit in a lot in a short amount of time. So there are a number of things I'll skim over, and the end of this presentation, the last 9 or so slides are really reference tools. So I'm going to refer to them, but by and large, stick with the previous 20 or so slides. If we get to those, great. If not, that's okay too. Y'all can kind of just use them as you need later. I've also included a number of resources at the end so you can find further information. So first thing, what is ARIA?
Hey, Gia, I hate to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but we are not seeing your slides.
Oh, you're not? Oh, because I never actually shared them. Okay. There we go. Can you see them now?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So much that lifetime of IT work did me. Okay, here we go. So what is ARIA? ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It refers to a set of attributes that you can add to HTML elements that make web content and applications more accessible to users who use assistive technology. What types of web content and applications? Technically, all of them. But more frequently, ARIA is used to add attributes to non-native HTML elements. We'll talk a little bit about what non-native means. Come back here. So non-native elements make content interactive, attractive, and interesting. And when we say non-native elements, those are elements that are controlled by both HTML and another programming language. So HTML is the native language of an internet browser. A non-native language would be JavaScript, PHP, jQuery, that kind of thing. Browsers can interpret those languages, but by and large, the native language of a browser is HTML. So whenever you hear me refer to the word native, I'm talking about HTML. So some kinds of elements that include non-native languages are collapsible divs, so like toggles, date pickers, tabbed content, drop-down selectors you'd see in forms, sliders, like photo sliders, modals, which are similar to pop-up boxes, things that kind of look like a page within a page. And users interact with these in a number of different ways. So they can select the element, they can check the element like a checkbox, they can drag and drop them, they can resize them, move them around, hide them, show them, that kind of thing. So generally, when you're thinking about should I use ARIA on this thing? Many times, not all, but many times it's going to be, does the user interact with this content in a way that means they have to use their keyboard or their mouse in some way to interact with it? These are some visual examples of what elements like this look like. So when I talk about collapsible divs, saying like toggles and accordions, you can see what tabbed content looks like, first tab, second tab. Oftentimes with that, the first tab is active or open. Drop down selects, you see frequently in forms. Date pickers, same thing, you see frequently in forms. Or when you're experiencing a date picker through a calendar, you're trying to find a date in a calendar. So what does ARIA add? ARIA adds meaning. ARIA adds meaning to these elements so that assistive technology can pass that meaning on to users. And you're going to hear me use the word semantics a lot in this presentation. In an IT context, the word semantics, the term semantics refers to the meaning of an element or an attribute. So know that when I say semantic, I'm specifically talking about the meaning of that particular attribute and the meaning that that attribute adds to an element and in turn to the user experience for someone who is using assistive technology. What types of attributes does ARIA add? So there's three types of attributes in ARIA. You don't actually have to know whether an attribute is a role, a state, or a property in order to use it. But because a lot of documentation will refer to these things as roles, states, and properties, it's at least helpful to know what they mean. So a role is an attribute that identifies a feature for user interaction. A state is an attribute that describes the state of a feature. And a property is an attribute that describes the purpose of an element or how elements relate to each other. So either the purpose or a relationship. The one thing ARIA does not do is modify the appearance or behavior of any HTML elements. So it only adds meaning. It does not modify appearance or behavior. And it only adds that meaning for people who are using assistive technologies. Regular browser users who are not using assistive technologies will not have additional meaning for their experience because of ARIA. So first one, roles. A role is an attribute that informs assistive technologies what type of element the content is. Roles can add additional meaning to HTML elements or modify the meaning of HTML elements. So in this first example, this is an unordered list. And in this unordered list, it is giving the role menu. That's telling the user that this is not just any unordered list. This unordered list is a menu. Roles can also add additional labeling or descriptions to HTML elements. So in this case, this area of the website is given the role main. This is actually a specific role or type of role in ARIA called a landmark. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end. There's also a reference slide at the end about landmarks and what makes landmarks a bit special. But for now, you just need to know that this is adding an additional description to an area in the HTML page in order for users of assistive technology to go through and identify those areas more easily. Second type of attribute is a state. And states and properties are often grouped together in documentation. So you will see them together quite frequently because they are similar. A state is an attribute that informs assistive technology of the current state or condition of the element. And a state differs from a property in that their value is likely to change throughout the time that a user interacts with the web page or application. So technically, there's overlap basically between states and properties. It's a kind of a gray definition, if you will, but the biggest difference is that a state is likely to change and a property is not. So the most common of these examples is a checkbox. So checkbox can be disabled or checked. In that case, ARIA disabled is true, ARIA checked is true, kind of thing. You see this also when I had been showing toggles before. I use states and toggles. So a state would be ARIA expanded true, which means that that toggle is expanded on the page when the page loads. which is different from the rest of the toggles that are shut or closed when the page loads. The last attribute is a property. So a property is an attribute that informs assistive technology of the purpose of an element or whether it has a relationship to another element. So like I said before, properties are not likely to change throughout the time that a user interacts with the web page or application. And there are essentially two types of properties. One that describes the purpose of an element. So in this case, the purpose of this button is that it will close and return to the previous page. And but the text of the button is just close. So if you did not have that ARIA label on there, then a person who is using assistive technology would not know that when they clicked on that button, it would return them to the previous page, or they would not realize that they had been returned to the previous page without that label being there. When you establish a relationship, that's especially useful and used most frequently, I've found, in forms. And so it's a way of being able to associate descriptions like this format with the actual input of what needs to go in there. So now that you know what ARIA is, we're going to talk about how and when you would actually use it. So ironically, first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. This is not just the first rule, but really this is the basis of the second rule too. And it seems a little counterintuitive. Why are we doing an entire presentation on how you shouldn't be using these attributes at all? But this is all to encourage you to use native semantics. ARIA is not a native semantic, as I had mentioned before. I'm going to keep harping on that. What that means is that browsers don't pick up on it. Only accessibility technology can recognize ARIA. And that can play out in a few different ways. You always want to use what the browser can recognize first and best, because you're going to be able to provide the most accessibility for the most amount of people. And so ARIA is something that can enhance what you're doing, but by and large, if you can use native semantics, you should. So the 5 rules of using ARIA: don't use ARIA, use native HTML instead. Similar to that, don't change native semantics unless absolutely necessary. And I'll go through all of these and show you some more detail with some examples of what these actually mean. All interactive ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. Don't use role presentation or ARIA hidden true on a focusable element. And all interactive elements must have an accessible name. And if you're wondering if I have made up these rules, these are W3C's rules. They're kind of pretty universally recognized as the rules for using ARIA. So first one, don't use ARIA, use native HTML instead. So if you can use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantics and behavior you require already built in, instead of repurposing a different element and adding an ARIA role, state, or property to make it accessible, then do so. Essentially, don't recreate the wheel. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. And in general, native HTML is the most robust option. It works on every device. And native HTML elements actually cause browsers to provide keyboard behaviors and styling. An example of this is focus elements on buttons. A lot of browsers now recognize that buttons are focusable elements and have added their own built-in default styles for focusing on buttons for a user with a keyboard that is a keyboard user. So if that, because the browser can't pick up on the role button, then those built-in styles are not going to show up. They're only going to show up if you use the button tag. So in this example, you can see instead of using a div or instead of changing a link to a role that is button, use the button tag. And that is more likely to be picked up by browsers automatically and has more far-reaching implementation. And I have the same thing with divs. In general, if you find yourself adding a role to a div, do a check, just like do a little Google search. Is there another thing I could use here? And oftentimes there is. We're going to go into landmarks, as I mentioned before, and that's a good example of this. That was something that used to be all divs and now has its own native semantics that go along with it. So oftentimes, if you're wondering if something needs to be a div or if it can be its own native element, just do a quick search for it and you might find something that works better. Do not change native semantics unless absolutely necessary. So most HTML elements and attributes convey one or more semantics already without you having to add anything new to it. Changing the native semantics produces code that does not act in a reliable or expected way, and browsers and assistive technology don't know what to do with that. Which, like, bottom line is you're actually making things worse if you add some kind of ARIA meaning to a role, to an element that isn't made for that or doesn't have that as part of who it is. It just doesn't fit. It's like round peg, square hole kind of thing. The other thing to remember is that this is also something that's not super new, but fairly new in HTML5. So if you, in HTML5, one of the primary advancements was that they introduced semantic elements. And those are elements that are designed to, like I said, add meaning to the structure of a document and make it clear that what those elements are for and the purpose they serve in the document. And since those are standardized elements, they are defined in a way that everyone can use and understand, including robot crawlers, the browser technology, all of those things. If you're working on, let's say, a theme in WordPress or an older website that was built before HTML5, you might have divs with roles all over the place. Like, you might have a very div heavy situation where your developer used classes to create this kind of meaning and did that through styles rather than through semantics. And so some of this you might be looking at and saying, like, well, that's not how my site works. And it might be just that it's a little bit outdated. So that's okay. And there are ways you can still add. In those cases, you may want to add more ARIA than what I am discussing right now. But the bottom line is still that you should not change native semantics because it still is essentially meaningless. Rule number 3, all interactive ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. If you create a widget that a user can click or tap or drag or drop or slide or scroll, the user must also be able to navigate to the widget and perform an equivalent action using the keyboard. And all interactive widgets must be scripted to respond to standard keystrokes or keystrokes combinations where applicable. And common example of this is a button. So that button should be able to receive focus, and the user must be able to activate the action associated with the element using both the enter or return and space key. And that's a standardized keyboard interaction. And that means that the user can expect how to use that element. Now, if you are a content manager or a front-end developer, like I am, you will likely never have to actually implement this yourself. But this is something to be very aware of when you're using plugins to manage content, because not all plugins are accessible. And to make sure that you're in contact with your backend developers or your software engineers about making sure that interactive controls are usable with a keyboard. So a lot of that interactivity is going to be built in languages other than HTML. So if you are not working in JavaScript, PHP, jQuery, Python, the other languages that are evident on a page, then you likely won't come into this or be working with this as frequently, but it is something to be aware of and something that will get flagged. And the last rule, is that the last one? No, this is the fourth one. Fourth rule, don't hide focusable elements. So specifically, don't use role equals presentation or ARIA hidden equals true on a focusable element. Really, you shouldn't be hiding any focusable elements. But using either of these on a focusable element will result in some users focusing on nothing. And these are some examples of code not to use. In all honesty, I could go in, there could be an entire presentation in and of itself on how to display, how to hide and display elements in an accessible way. And maybe that's a future digital accessibility presentation that needs to happen. I'm going to gloss over this one a little bit because there's a lot of different ways that you can hide elements. But just know that if there is a focusable element, you try to hide it, essentially what happens is that the person who is using assistive technology gets, they still focus on it. Like it still gets, either they were focused on nothing, but there's still something there essentially. So it can be very confusing. And there are some best practices about how to hide or display things that you want to not be there. Again, this is one of those situations where if it sounds kind of complicated and you're like, when should I hide something or not hide something? You might want to just go back and redo your code so it's not there in the first place if you have access to it. If you don't have access to it, contact your DAO office. They are super helpful about helping you figure out what and how something should be hidden. So just keep this in mind. Like I said, I'm just glossing over it, but it is something to remember. Okay, last part is all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So the accessible name is the name of a user interface element, and an interactive element only has an accessible name when its accessibility API accessible name or equivalent property has a value. Essentially what that means is the accessibility API is the software that your user is using to access the site using assistive technology. And so there has to be a name that that software can specifically pick up. And so if you see on the left side, the username within the span or a username before the input type, that's not something that is actually being applied to the input type. It's just something that's next to the input type. So visually, a user who is using the website and is able to see that label username in front of the input type would be able to put those two together. But if a user is unable to see that text or just reads username and then there is a field after it, it means nothing. They have no idea why that's there. So you have to actually add either an ARIA label that labels that input, or you need to create a relationship. So the first one is ARIA label creates meaning. The second one creates relationship. Both of them add meaning though. So there's so many rules. What is the point? Why? Again, if I'm telling you not to use ARIA at all, then why are we going through all of this? And I just really want to stress the point that if you're having a hard time making a component accessible, it will likely also be too complicated for users to use without assistive technology. So maybe just rethink the whole thing, simplify your design and your setup. If you're having a hard time making something accessible, and you're able to kind of go back and rethink how it's all put together, it's going to help all of your users, not just those that use assistive technology. So sometimes that I frequently use ARIA. I am a front-end developer. I work primarily in WordPress. So much of the semantics of the pages I'm working on are built into the theme or into WordPress core. And so to be perfectly honest, in the interest of transparency, the most frequent times I use ARIA are when my site improve scan or the manual review that DAO does of my website comes back and tells me that I need to use ARIA. I often forget that I need to do it because I'm working pretty fast. So if you're wondering how am I going to remember all of this, someone or a robot will likely tell you. But also, now that I've been doing this for a while, you can recognize just places that need ARIA. I've kept like a running list, and this might be helpful for you too. Once you get a couple of, feedback back that these are certain places that are kind of like ARIA traps, then it might be helpful for you to know. So the first one is when I'm using a plugin, a shortcode, or a theme that has been developed in a way that doesn't use semantic elements or in a configuration that doesn't have a semantic equivalent. So we use Events Calendar Pro that has a lot of needs in it that are not semantic. Forms are one of these. There's frequently plugins with WordPress or shortcodes with WordPress that don't think about ARIA or were created, before the widespread adoption of web accessibility standards. So oftentimes we will attempt to add it, and if we're not able to add it, then we'll contact the developer and ask them if they'll add it for us. And then there's workarounds for that as well. Like if you need to also include written instructions or some other kind of way that a user can submit their information rather than using a form or rather than accessing these interactive elements, then you may have to end up doing that too. Indicating that an interactive element is active, expanded, etc. I talked a little bit about this with toggles, but that's one I use frequently. Continued or read more links. So we use custom post types a lot, and often when you're using a custom post type, let's say I have a list of news articles, and the excerpt of those news articles, there's a link that automatically gets created after, let's say, 200 words of the excerpt that links to the full article. The default link text is continued or read more, because either that's what the client asked for or that's how the plugin works. But we know that that is a meaningless link text by and large. So we add ARIA label, and I'll add read more about and then put in the title of the news article or something like that in the ARIA label. And so that'll create meaning for those links. And then the last piece is forms. So as we saw before, creating relationships, especially for inputs, making sure that users understand which inputs are for which fields. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I'm going to go through the next 3 slides just because they mention the times I frequently use ARIA, but then after that, most of the rest of these slides are, like I mentioned, referenced, and I want to make sure that I have time for questions. So just quickly, some examples of when I use states of interactive elements. Like I said, ARIA checked indicates the current checked state of checkboxes, radio buttons, other widgets. ARIA expanded indicates whether an element or a group of elements is currently expanded or collapsed. ARIA disabled indicates that an element is perceivable but disabled. We often interpret that, if you are a sighted user, as something that looks grayed out. You can't interact with it. Some related ones to that are ARIA hidden and ARIA read only. More examples of how I use ARIA frequently. Like I said, continue to read more. So you can see in here, the link text is read more, but the ARIA label is read more about this thing. Similarly, if you have, let's say, a set of resources to be downloaded and you want to provide those resources in a number of different file types, then you can provide each one of those file types, and that link has a description of what type of file it is in there. And then forms. So one thing to know about labeling elements, you'll see label frequently. And this is an example of a property that establishes a relationship. So you have a label for first name, and this is where it says first name colon, and then input is the actual field. But this matches, label for first name matches the ID first name. And so that's how you create that relationship. Ditto with this checkbox, subscribe. The name for the input type matches the label for it. I think it's actually the ID that needs to match. I've gotten into this issue before. A lot of plugins will add a name but not an ID. So the ID is what needs to match the label in order for most assistive technology to pick up on that. You can also associate descriptive text. So in here, there's a description of what, oh, whoops, I did not mean to do that. I'll go back. The description of what this password needs to be and how it needs to look. You can also denote required fields pretty easily using ARIA, which is nice. And okay, I am going to stop there and just give a quick pause for questions and see if any folks would like to ask. Let me open up that chat. Come on. Okay.
And Gia, I haven't seen any questions come in just yet, but just as a reminder to everyone, if y'all want to, if you have any questions for Gia, please put them in the question and answer or Q&A menu in Zoom to make sure that we don't miss it.
Well, I don't see any questions either. And yeah, these slides are, I don't know how long they'll be. Chelsea, do you know how long these will be downloadable?
As long as you would like to leave them available, really. We'll keep the site up for quite some time. I think we were talking about leaving the slides up for at least a few weeks. So they will be available for a while. And currently, just so everyone knows, the slides are not downloadable, but we will be getting those downloadable for most of our presentations soon once we talk to all of the presenters, including Gia. Well, and now that we've given them a couple of moments to think about some questions, we've had some come in. Larry asks, what are accessible alternatives for drop and drag columns in a table?
Yeah, so my first reaction to that is tables aren't accessible, so don't use them in general. If you do need to use tables and you have some drag and drops, so you can add ARIA to say that something is draggable, or something can be dragged. So that is something that you can indicate using a state or property. Oftentimes, I usually, oh, it looks like Chelsea. Oh no, wait, that just says I'm answering it, Chelsea. Okay, not you.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Keep doing what you're doing.
I will often, those ones in general, drag and drop columns, I do often choose to switch those around. I'll kind of break them up into a series of radio boxes or a series of check boxes rather than that kind of drag and drop situation, just because it's hard to do on mobile. The user interface on mobile is kind of a challenge, even though I think they look really cool. It's a challenge on mobile, and it usually ends up getting switched on mobile to a different type anyway. And also, even though those are draggable elements, it's not guaranteed that the user is going to be able to determine where to drag them on a screen, how far to move their mouse, what direction to move their mouse in. And those are all pieces that you would have to include in the ARIA anyway. So that's a situation where I would say, keep it simple, switch to something else. It's probably frustrating to hear, but that's what I would say. So screen readers pick up on dynamic rather than load time changes, for example, based on under their editing a field changes from editable to read only. Yes, as long as there is AJAX changes happening, as in like in browser changes, the browser does not completely refresh. And so that might be an option within the plugin when you're working in it to determine whether in-page browser changes force a refresh of the browser page, or whether those changes can be dynamic within the page. If they are dynamic within the page, either one, accessibility technology will pick up on it, but it will be picked up on in a different way, depending on how that feature is enabled. And you may have to do some testing there to figure out how your users are interacting with that. I know a lot of that, yeah, there's usually not a page refresh. Yeah, then it should pick up on it, because as they tab through the fields, let's say, and I know I can envision what you're talking about, like you click a checkbox that says, yes, I will attend, and then it opens up a input field that says, like, please put in how many people are coming in your party, right? Because the user will then tab to the next one will already be expanded, let's say, or not disabled once they get there. So yes, it will pick up on that. Alex, I have to admit, I have not done a ton with the new Bootstrap accessibility. We're still working on Bootstrap 4 on our instance of WordPress. So I haven't had as much experience with it, but I'm interested to see what they do. And I'm glad that it seems to be a lot less of the roles and it's a lot more native in general.
Great, Gia. Great answers, great questions, everybody. I did have one or two other ones, and this is sort of coming, these questions are sort of coming from the other side of the table. So for people like myself who are not developers, and figuring out best ways of communicating with the developers who are working on content. So I guess just one thing that we see a lot in accessibility are either developers who are not using any ARIA or developers who love ARIA and are using it on everything, including things that are probably don't need ARIA, like they're putting roles on things that already have semantics on them. Just kind of looking for your advice on best ways of communicating with developers on accessibility needs like that, and when and where to use ARIA.
Yeah, so I think this is a very this really speaks to the developer mindset, right? It's zeros and ones. It's all or nothing, right? We can't. It's hard often. We don't like gray areas. Programmers do not like gray areas. We don't like there being more than one way to do things. We like the most efficient way. And so I will say that learning, I did not, like I said before, like I'll be perfectly honest, my entire context for ARIA was when I would get a report back and they'd say, you have to use ARIA, and I'd be like, okay, I believe you, I'm putting it in until I put together this presentation. And so I think a little bit of just knowing the difference between native semantics and ARIA and which one gets, like why one is overkill and why one is insufficient is helpful. And I think also making sure that, like I was not aware also that there was really no way in a lot of ways, in a lot of the plugins I was using, especially to add ARIA, like that I had to put a request in for that. And you spend a lot of time like realizing that, because I'd search everywhere for like how to add this in. And if it's just not part of the shortcode or it's not part of the plugin options, then you're kind of SOL. So I think that it'll just take, I would encourage you to be patient with us, I guess, is what I'm saying.
That is a great question, and I think patience all around is the best practice. Paul has a question there in Q&A. When you pitch to make things more accessible, thoughts on dealing with a PI who says, I don't care?
So I'm guessing by PI you mean principal investigator, like a faculty member. I am a big policy person, and we thankfully have a really strong digital accessibility policy at the school, at the university, UNC-Chapel Hill, which is my home institution. And I just straight up say, well, you are legally required to follow digital accessibility standards. And now you know that you are legally required to follow accessibility standards. And if you don't follow them, then you are liable for whatever happens by not following them. And I've told you about this, like there's documentation that I've told you about this. So it might sound kind of like passing the buck, but I do encourage you, if your institution does not have a strong digital accessibility policy, to write one, and to make sure that leadership is on board and understands how important it is for everyone to be on board with that. And also just make sure your boss will back you up. I've been really lucky to have a number of supervisors who are on board with my insistence on things being accessible. I'm also in a position where I'm able to say, I won't build it if it's not accessible. So if you're in a position to do that, I encourage you to do that. It's the right thing. It is, in many cases, the legal thing to do. So it can be awkward, but I think you have like the full spectrum of institutional moral high horse behind you. Is there an intro level training that can teach newbies more about the basics of ARIA? Oh my gosh, you'd like reference materials and additional links? Suzanne, I would love to. Let me show you what else we've got in this slide deck. So the last 6 or 7 or so slides, I have ARIA label versus ARIA labeled by. I'm just gonna like run through these so y'all can see what's in here. And then at the end, I promise there's links like you just asked for. So the one I didn't include in here was ARIA described by, but one of the links includes ARIA described by in this comparison. These are just attributes that do some of the same things, but in different ways. Again, one of those like, this is kind of an art, not a science situation. So you can read through those. This is a like when you should use one versus the other for ARIA labeled versus ARIA labeled by. This is all about landmarks. And I have 3 slides on landmarks, and I'll come back to that in a second because that is something that comes up a lot. And then at the end of this, there's a set of helpful links. I found this set of California Community College Accessibility Center videos really useful when I was putting this presentation together. And so I would encourage you all to check out those links in the slides that were shared on the website. Those links should all be active. So check those out. They're all really short videos, very easy to follow. W3C and WebAIM also have some good resources, but to be perfectly frank, a lot of the stuff that W3C and WebAIM put out is really dense. And I would encourage you to maybe start with those videos because they give you a much more simplified idea of what's going on there. Okay, I see there's someone in the chat. Well, and my mouse disappears when I go up there.
I think that's it, what we have for questions. The only other side thing that we were talking about this just to see if you had any info is, do you know of any example sites that do a good job at demoing ARIA, whether good or bad or indifferent, to help show stakeholders and developers like what it is, why it's important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would love to find a really good example. I think I have not seen one that's a really good example, but I would keep that in mind, kind of send it as a follow-up.
That's one of those dream sites. If somebody would like to help everybody out, go make that site for us. Well, we have another minute or so. I just want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A. And I will spend this time in case anybody is typing a question to thank everybody for coming to this presentation. Gia, it's been wonderful. And if you had mentioned something about landmarks, if you want to talk about that a little bit, see if anybody has questions in the meantime.
Yeah, so landmarks are something that also come up a lot, especially again, if you're using a website template or if you're in a CMS and you're using a theme or page template that was created before HTML5, you may get a lot of pings that you need to use ARIA roles to create landmarks. I just want to talk a little bit about what landmarks are. Landmarks are attributes that you add to elements to create semantically defined sections of a page. This allows users of assistive technologies to navigate the page more easily. So essentially it allows them to build a set of skip to links, and they can skim the content a lot more easily, which if you've ever used a screen reader, you know that it reads everything and maybe you don't need to know, like you're already on the page you need to go on, you can skip through the nav, you don't need to listen to the whole mission header again, whatever's up there. So these are all the regions that you can add ARIA landmarks to, and it defines specific regions. Application is usually used if there's like a specific interactive application within a page. Banners usually at the top. Complementary is usually information that is important information, but it's not part of the top banner or inside of the main content. There's content info, form, main, navigation, and search. Those are all kind of self-explanatory. So these are some examples of simple landmarks. And you can see these are all added by role. And so you'd add role banner, role search, role navigation. These are all included as divs, but search also could be an input. So you could add role search to an input element. And then something to know is that landmarks have been replaced by semantic markup in HTML5. So you only need to use landmarks if you're working on outdated markup or if you have users that use Internet Explorer, because that's the only browser that doesn't consistently support HTML5. So now instead of doing div ID main, you would just use the main tag, or div ID footer, you would just use the main footer, or role main or role footer. You would just use the actual semantic markup for that. I've gotten into this issue I've used landmarks and had to kind of add divs with landmarks when I have a client who wants a design where they want information, let's say like an alert box that would normally go into a like a header or a banner, but they want it somewhere else on the page. And in the DOM, that does not work. And so I have to create a new role for it. I'll often add, for example, role complementary, and that will indicate that this is information that is complementary to the information on the page, even though it's not where it predictably would be in somewhere like a banner. So that's kind of the quick and dirty about landmarks. Like I said, here are those links at the end. I'm gonna check the chat.
Well, great. Thank you again. I'm not seeing any other questions or anything. So thank you so much, Gia. That was very informative, very useful information. Everybody else, go on and take a break, stretch your legs, get something to drink, and we will have another presentation coming up at 2 o'clock.